Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to the Hello, Old Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. We'd like to thank you for once again listening to the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. We are but one of the many great sports history shows here on the network, covering everything from basketball to football to boxing. There's even a new wrestling history show on the Sports History Network. So lots of fun stuff going on. We encourage you to check it out at sportshistorynetwork.com. We also encourage you to check us out on Facebook, Hello Old Sports Podcast. We encourage you to email us if you so desire, hellooldsports@gmail.com. If you have any ideas for shows or comments, feedback, anything of that. We just a couple of episodes ago did our very first listener requested episode on the 1959 Chicago White Sox, the Go-Go White Sox. So feel free to reach out to us there. And you can also, as always, follow us on your podcast app of choice, like, rate, review. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you don't like. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Dan. That guy doesn't know it, by the way, yet, but I'll be a guest on his wrestling podcast.
It is.
I will be inviting myself on his podcast.
It is Wrestling with Heels. It is the new podcast on the Sports History Network. And every week he tells the story of a different wrestling heel in the history of wrestling. He's done Abdullah the Butcher. He's done the Magnificent Morocco. I forget who the third one he did was. So, yes, I certainly encourage you, Andrew, to go on his show, and maybe we'll have him on ours.
And we'll be focusing specifically on my remarkable heel run in the Backyard Wrestling Federation I ran in ninth grade. By the way, but
what was that?
I was the booker too.
Funny how that works.
Coincidentally, I was the champion. But I'm excited about tonight for a few reasons. The year we're going to be discussing is the year I was born. It's also a big year in New York sports, only being one of my teams. But I sort of, grew up with not any firsthand knowledge, but just sort of having a bit of probably because it was when I was born, but having a bit of a soft spot for this year we're going to discuss. Obviously, there's some positives, some negatives, but I've liked the two we've done. We did one on 1920 and one on 1941 where we kind of looked at every year. This is obviously a much more recent year, but I think it's going to be good.
So in previous episodes, the first one of these that we did was 1920, when we talked about the 100 years ago. We did it last year, and we talked about Babe Ruth's breakout season. We talked about the founding of the NFL. We talked about the founding of the Negro Leagues and a bunch of other stuff, 1920 Olympics. And then we did, over the summer, we did 1941, which is 80 years ago. And we talked a lot of baseball. We talked about the DiMaggio streak. We talked about Ted Williams and the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1941 World Series. Talked a lot about Joe Louis and his reign as champion during that time. I think this is probably, of the three we've done, this is the one that probably is the least baseball focused, which is something to say if you think about it, given what a big deal baseball was and all the crazy things in the postseason in 1986. But of all of this being the third that we've done, this is the first one that I feel like is not mostly baseball.
Any time before the 50s, you're not really talking about the NBA. And to be honest, depending on where you want to start it, maybe even later than that, the NFL, at least prior to World War II, was not the same sort of animal. So this is the first modern year we've done. And I don't know where you would start modern, probably at least, somewhere in the 60s, but there's plenty of baseball to talk about. Certainly there's plenty of baseball to talk about, but there's plenty of other stuff to talk about too. I don't think there's any less baseball to talk about this year than there were with the other ones. It's just that there's so much more of everything else.
And we should note as we begin this, knowing the topic and knowing the verbosity of our hosts, that this is almost certainly going to be a 2-episode series, that we'll start this episode and then finish it up next time. We don't know how far we're going to get with this first time around, but we're going to start and see how far we get, and then we'll finish it up in our next episode. So if you like what you hear tonight, then stick around, because there's another episode coming where we finish up our look into 1986.
And just as we get started here, we're obviously going to be talking about the year 1986. With sports, it's a little bit tricky because there are things that happened in 1986 that don't really happen in what we're considering the sports year of 1986. But then there are things that happened in 1987 that definitely are considered part of 1986. And there's kind of stuff that happened in 1985. So if you're talking about the 1985-86 NBA season, stuff that happened in October of 85, not that there's that much, but sort of maybe counts. And then, but the real place where it comes in is the NFL. So when we talk about the 1986 NFL season, we're talking about the season that started in September of 86 and ran through January of 87. The 1985 NFL playoffs in January, the famous Bears run to the Super Bowl, obviously was in the calendar year, but not really in the sports year.
So I think we're going to sort of take this with 3 pillars, which are the 3 seasons and playoffs in the 3 major sports, MLB, NFL, and NBA. And then in between those, we'll sort of go on some digressions to some of the smaller things that happen, some of the other sports that maybe we don't usually focus as much here on the podcast. And Andrew's right. It's the 4 sports where you consider the playoffs, the 86 playoffs. So that's June, spring, I should say, of 86 for hockey and basketball. That's the October of 86 for baseball. And then that's January of 87 for the NFL. So with all of that said, would you like to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, so we'll do basketball, baseball, football, hockey, tennis, golf, auto racing, all that tonight, and then the second part will be just about wrestling. 1986, and I will at least mention that. But yep, I'm ready to get started. So where do you want to kick things off?
I guess we should probably start with the NBA, and we are smack dab in the middle of the golden age of the NBA. The famous 80s Celtics Lakers, the great rivalry. Do you disagree with it as the golden age?
Golden age of the NBA starts in 12 minutes when the Knicks take on the Bulls. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So the Lakers and Celtics had met the 2 previous years in the NBA Finals. In 84, the Celtics had beaten the Lakers in 7 games. And then in 85, the Lakers, led by sort of a surprising finals MVP series by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at the age of 38, he manages to lead the Lakers to a 6-game victory over the Celtics in the 85 finals. So going into this season, there have been 2 championships by the Lakers. No, take that back. There have been 3 by the Lakers, 2 by the Celtics. Philly snuck in there in 81. Philly snuck in there in 83, I should say, and beat the Lakers, swept them in 4 games. And we talked about some of those Dr. J. Moses teams in a previous episode. And going into this season, everybody is very much expecting it to be the Lakers and the Celtics again. But as we'll see, it doesn't really work out that way. And I think maybe that's where we should start, because the Lakers, despite having represented the Western Conference in the previous 4 NBA finals don't manage to make it back in the 86 finals, and they lose in the Western Conference finals to an upstart team from Houston.
In the early 2000s, when Bill Simmons was kind of, I don't want to say revolutionary, but sort of changing sports journalism and stuff like that. And I think a lot of guys like him, you sort of become what you despised all along, where he's now considered kind of the old guard. But one of the things he would always say as a Boston sports fan, and I think it was one of those where he says it mostly joking, but there's a part of him that believed it, was that the Lakers wanted no part of the Celtics in the finals that year in their rubber match. The Celtics had won in 84, the Lakers had won in 85. This was going to be the third straight year, and this was the best of those Celtics teams. They very famously went 40-1 at home that year. And his contention was always sort of that the Lakers, not that they threw the series, but that they might have started to get a little bit of bug-eyed looking at what they were going to have to deal with in the finals, and we're okay to lose to the Rockets in the Western Conference Finals.
So the Lakers had been led, obviously, by Magic and by Kareem, and to a secondary extent by James Worthy. Michael Cooper was a veteran presence off the bench. Byron Scott had been with the team for a few years as a starting shooting guard. But they also had two power forwards, Jamal Wilkes, who had won a championship with the Warriors in the 70s. He was a famous UCLA player when he was known as Keith Wilkes in the early 70s. And then he had a good career with the Warriors and then moved on to the Lakers, where he continued to have a really good career. And then they also had a guy by the name of Bob McAdoo, who had won an MVP with the Buffalo Braves in the 1970s. And McAdoo, off the bench, was one of the key role players of those early and mid-'80s Lakers. After the 85 season, both Wilkes and McAdoo leave the Lakers. I believe they both retire. I think Wilkes definitely does. I'm not sure yet about McAdoo. I could double check on that, but I'm pretty sure that they both retire after the 85 season. And so the Lakers have a hole at the forward position, particularly at the power forward position. And they do another thing. They do two things to try and fill that gap. And they bring in, the first is that they draft AC Green, who ends up eventually moving into the starting lineup and becomes one of the key players on the late 80s Lakers teams that win the back-to-back titles in 87 and 88. And then they also sign a guy by the name of Maurice Lucas. Maurice Lucas had been a star player for the Blazers. He'd been sort of the second guy on the Bill Walton 1977 NBA Finals championship Portland team. But he was not a guy who got along well with his teammates. And he comes to LA, and it's an immediate clash. And he doesn't get along well really with anybody. He clashes with Riley over everything from playing time to how much he's getting the ball to his seat on a flight. This was back when the team still flew commercial, and Lucas was angry because he didn't get a first-class seat, even though his seniority entitled him to it, and actually ends up filing a union grievance during his one season with the Lakers. And it's sort of like oil and water. And there's a story how about 2/3 of the way through the season in the 85-86 NBA season, the Lakers are playing, and I'll just give me a minute here to pull up.
So McAdoo, after the 85 season, the Lakers opted not to re-sign him. I guess it was sort of a decision to bring in Lucas instead of bringing back McAdoo. He then went and played in about 30 games for the Sixers the next year, and that was it for him in the NBA. But he then played in Italy until 1992.
Oh, wow.
He played 6 more years of basketball, which would have taken him until he was in his 40s. He was almost done in the NBA, but still was a long ways from retirement.
So in December 12th, it's even earlier in the season than I thought it was. It's only about a month and a half into the season. Lucas goes on a tear. He scores 17 points in 22 minutes against his former team, against Phoenix, which was another team he had played with. Midway through the third quarter, Magic Johnson glares disgustingly at Lucas as he dribbles the ball up the court.
He probably glared disgustedly.
Disgustedly, I'm sorry, you're right. Glares at Lucas and calls a 20-second timeout. Riley says, "What's going on? Is somebody hurt?" Johnson says, "I can't play with this mother effer. Get him out of the effing game." And that was sort of the end of the Maurice Lucas. He does finish out the season with the Lakers, but the chemistry just isn't there. And so they do well. I don't know what was their final record. I think they might have even made it to 60 wins. They were not a bad team by any means.
I'll look it up.
85-86, they were 62-20. So that's still a pretty good.
They were the number one seed in the West.
Number one seed in the West, exact same record as the year before. So, yeah, still a damn good team, still the Lakers. But they go up against this Houston team in the finals, this Twin Towers, Akeem Olajuwon, Ralph Sampson team. And this is a team that's been lost to history because their time on the stage was really brief. It was basically only 1 year. But for that 1 year, they were a really, really, really good team.
Yep. And they beat the Lakers in 5. The key game there, in my opinion, was game 4 when they won 105-95 to go up 3-1 in the series. I say that was the key game. Do you know why that was the key game?
Not off the top of my head, no.
It's played on Sunday, May the 18th, 1986.
The day of your birth.
Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, you know, all you got to, almost forget about the 81 team that went to the finals. Yeah, there was the Rockets, but there was a weak team, whatever. All you have to think about is 82, 83, 84, 85 Lakers, 87, 88, 89 Lakers. And you could go a little further, but for our purposes, we'll stop there and say the Lakers made the NBA Finals 7 out of 8 years. The only Western Conference team to beat the Lakers in a playoff series in an 8-year period, essentially the entire Reagan presidency, if you want to look at it like that.
Mm-hmm.
The only Western Conference team that beat the Lakers in the playoffs in the Reagan administration was this series with the Rockets.
The main issue that they have is that Kareem just cannot guard Akeem Olajuwon. Olajuwon dominates the Lakers. They try and put anybody they can possibly put on him to guard him. Green, Lucas, Kareem, Kurt Rambis. Olajuwon eats all of their lunch. The Lakers win the first game and then lose the next 4. Ralph Sampson hits a buzzer beater to send the Lakers home, to send the Rockets to the NBA Finals. The Rockets go up against the Celtics, and the Rockets are, and I want to talk a little bit more about the Rockets before we get to the Celtics, but the Rockets are coached by Bill Fitch, who had been the Celtics coach in 81 when they beat the Rockets in the NBA Finals, but Fitch and Larry Bird just could not get along. And I think it's after the following year. I think it's after the 82 season that they basically forced Bill Fitch out of town. And then he hooks on instead with the Rockets, but it ends up being a really interesting. Oh, actually, I'm wrong. Fitch actually coaches the team all the way through 83. So 2 years after winning a championship. And then they force him out just before the 84 season when the Celtics win their second championship in the Bird years. But Bill Fitch, who just never could get along with any of his players, but especially with Larry Bird, is now the guy who's going to be going up against him in the finals. Unfortunately for this Rockets team, it just kind of falls apart after that 1 year. And this is, you talked about Bill Simmons. He writes about this book, about this team in his book of basketball that he wrote about 10, 12 years ago. They have drug issues. Two different players get suspended for cocaine. Sampson and Akeem both want new contracts. And then Sampson gets hurt halfway through the season in 86, 87. They trade him away within a couple of years. And so this team that everybody thought was the next new thing and going to be a challenge to the Lakers for years to come in the Western Conference, it's really kind of a flash in the pan that only lasts about a year. But for that 1 year, everybody thought they were the new thing and the new challenger in the NBA.
Yeah, and it turned out that what he actually had was that it was the team in the other conference that was closer to the end. The Lakers still had several more years left in them, whereas the other team in the dynasty in the 80s wasn't, for partially for reasons we'll get to, I'm sure, a little later, but they were the ones who didn't have much left in the tank, and that a team in Detroit was going to knock them off their pedestal. I think it's interesting, you mentioned this Rockets team, and this is obviously, like you said to start, we're in the very sort of middle of the 80s NBA, the Lakers and the Celtics. And I know they didn't play this year, but they're still the two big poles on opposite ends of the country in the NBA. So it's still very much, the 80s NBA, but you say the name Hakeem Olajuwon. So you're talking about, all right, a guy who would win a couple of titles in the 90s, would be a fence post in the NBA for all of the 90s, was also Patrick Ewing's rookie year. And as we go to the Eastern Conference and the Eastern Conference playoffs and start to talk about the Celtics, they begin their playoff run that year in a 1-8 matchup against Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls, and that's the famous Michael Jordan 63-point game in double overtime in a game they do lose, but sort of the first big pro moment for Michael Jordan.
Yeah, and we will get to that in a couple of minutes. So why don't we talk a little bit about this Celtics team, because this is widely considered one of the best single season teams in NBA history. They go 65 and are they 65 and 17? No, they're 67 and 15, even better. Like you said, they're 40-1 on the road. They only lose one game. They're 40-1 at home. They lose one game. They lose to Portland in December of 1985, and just pulling up the box score of that game. Nobody seems to have been hurt. Bird, McHale, Parrish, Johnson all play, but this is a team with 4 future Hall of Famers in the starting lineup, the entire front court, what becomes known in Boston as the Big Three: Bird, Parrish, McHale, all Hall of Famers. Dennis Johnson, who'd been the MVP of the NBA Finals with Seattle in 1979, is the starting point guard. Larry Bird later calls Johnson the best player he ever played alongside. And the shooting guard is Danny Ainge, who's a longtime star in the NBA. Maybe star might be a little bit of an overstatement, but a solid player, guy who makes an all-star team, really good player. And this is just probably one of the most dominant teams, certainly in Celtics history, in a lot of ways in NBA history. And the 86 Celtics are kind of considered in Boston sort of one of these teams of lore that still get talked about fondly even 35 years later.
Yeah, and, it's Bird at the absolute height of his powers, 29 years old. He's healthy. That he plays in he plays in every game. He starts all but one game that year. The only guy who really misses any kind of time is McHale, and that's, he only misses, a handful of games. Bird is the MVP. He averages, I can't see what he averages a game. I got to try to find it. But he's the MVP. He's obviously has to be considered his best year, right, in 86.
Yeah, and I'll get you his per game here in a second. Bird averages 25.8 points a game, 6.8 assists, 9.8 rebounds. So a great year for Bird. 3rd MVP season in a row for him. He wins the MVP in 84, 85, and 86. Celtics go to the finals all 3 years. It's worth noting that at this point, Magic has not won an MVP. The MVP the year before Bird won his 3 was Moses Malone in 83. And then before that, I think it was Dr. J one year. It was Kareem one year. Moses actually went back-to-back, I think, 82 and 83. So the Magic Bird debate in 86 is much different than it would be in 92 because Magic's career is on the upswing. His best years are still ahead of him in 1986, and Bird's best years are behind him by the time the 86 finals are over.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously some of that's all hindsight. At the time, it's, neither of them seem to be showing any signs of slowing down, and that, there was no reason to believe that both of these teams, with the Lakers, really, the Lakers still were the dominant team in the Western Conference for about 6 more years, on balance. This was that Celtics team that, and yeah, they won in 81 and they won in 84. But I mean, when you pick a team from this era, nobody ever says anything but the 86 team is the pinnacle of that, Celtics run, and probably has to be considered the greatest Celtics team of all time post Russell era.
Oh, I would absolutely agree. And, I lived in Boston a couple years ago, and there were many a time when you'd be flipping around the TV late at night and there'd be some sort of special on one of the sports channels about the 86 Celtics. One of the other things that I think is worth noting is that this is Bill Walton's year. Bill Walton, we've talked about Bill Walton before, who better college player than he was a pro. And when we did our NBA 75 episode a few weeks back, we both talked about how Walton's NBA career sometimes gets kind of overrated. The Blazers, he plays 65 games for the Blazers in 77 when they win the championship, and he's named MVP of both the finals and the regular season. And then he's having probably the best year of his career, Walton is, in 78 when he gets hurt, breaks his foot, misses the entire next year, gets traded to the San Diego Clippers, plays 14 games in 79-80, misses the next 2 full seasons. Then he does okay the next few years, plays somewhere between 30 and 65 games or so each of the next 3 years. But by 85, he feels that his career is basically over, not just physically, but emotionally. He's tired of basketball and really wants to go to a winning team. And in the 1980s, in the NBA, there really are only 2 winning teams, the Lakers and the Celtics. He reaches out to the Lakers first. They don't want to take the risk with his injury history.
I never thought about that. Bill Walton, UCLA, California. I never thought about the fact that he ended up on the Celtics instead of the Lakers is pretty surprising.
Yeah, but I almost have to wonder if that would have been not as good of a fit for him. First of all, the Lakers were deeper. The Celtics are pretty damn deep too. Every member of their front line was made the Hall of Fame, but Magic, Kareem.
I don't see Kareem enjoying Bill Walton at that stage in both their careers, on top of the whole UCLA, who's the greatest player. Like, I'm not saying it would have been a fit. I'm just more, it had never occurred to me that, that's a little surprising. Like,
plus he'd been playing in Southern California for the last several years with the Clippers, first in San Diego, and then his last year with the Clippers was their first year in LA. So it would have made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But they won't do it. Auerbach takes the risk, and Walton ends up playing 80 games with the Celtics. He drops into the starting lineup for a little while when McHale's hurt. There's a famous story about before a game when McHale's hurt and Walton's warming up on the sidelines, and Bird comes over to him and he says, I know you think that those touches that usually go to Kevin are going to go to you, but no, those are all mine. You don't get those. The other great Bird story from that season, I believe it's from that season, is that McHale and Bird do not, it's an overstatement to say that McHale and Bird don't get along, but they have very similar or very dissimilar personalities. McHale is sort of much more of like a lunch pail guy, just wants to put in his work, and not somebody who's overly competitive as far as personal accolades. And there's a game during this season where McHale has 57 or 58 points, and Bird's like trying to feed him the ball to get to the 60 points. And McHale eventually just says, you don't have to do this. I don't really care if I score 60 points. And Bird is like incensed with this. And a week or two later, Bird has a chance to score 60. He does, of course. And he turns to McHale and says, that's how you effing score 60 points. So very different personalities, but this is a team, they're not all that deep, the Celtics, when it comes to beyond that. Usually when you talk about the 86 Celtics, you talk about the starting five, you talk about Walton, and then really beyond that, it's a lot of guys who aren't as well known. Jerry Sichting, who we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, Scott Wedman, Rick Carlisle, who's been a coach in the league for 25 years at this point. So the other thing that's worth noting is that one of the other stars of the Celtics was Vernon Maxwell, who had been the MVP of the 81 finals and had kind of worn out as well. I'm sorry, it was Cedric Maxwell, not Vernon Maxwell. Cedric Maxwell, who had been the MVP of the 81 finals and had sort of worn out his welcome with the Lakers. Andrew's making a face. Did I get that wrong?
I don't see Cedric or Vernon Maxwell on the 86 Celtics.
No, he'd been the star, Cedric Maxwell, and he was MVP of the 81 finals and then got a big contract the year before or the year or two before from the Celtics. And depending on who you talk to, some people say that he got complacent once he got the big contract. There's a story where they're at practice and Maxwell is joking like, hey, somebody jump on my leg and snap it and I'll miss 6 weeks and I can, take a little vacation. And Bird hears this and is not happy and says, come on over here. I'll snap it for you right now. So Maxwell and Bird are kind of at odds. And so when the conversation arises and they can trade for Walton, they trade Maxwell away. They bring in Bill Walton. So this is a different Celtic team in 86 than even from a couple years ago. A lot of the guys, the Gerald Henderson, ML Carr, Cedric Maxwell, obviously, it's a different team in 86, but it's probably the best of the bunch.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. So they beat the Rockets in 5 games in the finals. It's not a tremendously competitive finals, especially in the context of the Lakers Celtics ones all around it.
6 games.
Oh, it's 6. Okay.
Game 5 in Houston is marred by a fist fight between Ralph Sampson and the backup Celtics guard, Jerry Sichting. Sampson is at least a foot taller than Sichting. He was 11 inches shorter, grabbed onto Sampson on the block and wrestled with him. And Sampson rears back and punched Sichting. They both get ejected from the game. Sampson is fined $5,000. They go back to Boston, and the Celtics fans are holding up signs that say things like Sampson is a sissy, or hey, Ralph, I'm 5'1", 90 pounds. Do you want to fight me too? Celtics blow them away, win the 86 finals, win the 86 championship, and the entire team, the entire city is ecstatic, none more so than Bill Walton. Bird celebrates a little bit in Boston. He's exhausted. He goes home and goes to bed by about 10:30. His phone keeps ringing, and eventually his wife picks it up and says to Bird, Bill Walton is on the phone. And Bird says, no, tell him I'm asleep. I can't come to the phone. Couple hours later, the doorbell rings at Bird's house. It's Bill Walton. This is what Walton says. I know you're tired and I know you're in bed, but I'm going to sit out here and listen to the Grateful Dead, and I'll be here when you wake up. So, Walton sits in his friend's kitchen all night, nursing a glass of wild turkey and reveling in the moment. And Walton later says, I sat there and enjoyed how wonderful it was to be on a team with Larry Bird.
Yeah, and Walton's a guy that's easy to make fun of, and I was never his biggest fan as a commentator. But that like a veteran guy, and I know he won in Portland as like the lead dog, but getting to win that at the tail end of his career after all the injuries, that's a nice story.
He's always said that team basically saved his life because he say what you will about Bill Walton, and God knows through the years, I've said a lot of things about Bill Walton. I think probably if you were anywhere in the Hopewell Junction, New York area, and when I was in junior high school and especially high school, watching a Knick playoff game with me, you probably heard me yell, "Shut the hell up, Walton," at least half a dozen times during the game. But the guy loves basketball. His whole life, he's loved basketball. He loves being around basketball. And I believe him when he talks about how depressed it made him, that he thought his career was over. And then he gets sort of this one shining season with the Larry Bird Celtics. And so he always has spoke just reverently about Bird, about the organization, about Auerbach. So yeah, it is. It's a touching story when you realize how much it meant to him to be on that Celtic team and win that championship. And then he starts getting hurt again. I think he only plays about 20 games the rest of his career. So his career is basically over after that anyway.
Yeah. I think it said 10 the next year, and then that was it from what I could say.
We should talk a little bit about this game with Jordan.
Yeah. So, Jordan, this is what his second or third year in the NBA.
Second season in the NBA. And the thing that's worth noting is that this is the only season, and that includes even up through the Wizards, where Jordan misses most of the season with an injury. He breaks his foot, and I think he misses something like 60 games with the Bulls. He comes back.
But real quick, they get into the playoffs as the 8th seed. Do you know what their record was?
I did know it just from looking this up. I remember that it was low. They were, what were they, 30 and 52?
30 and 52.
Well, you figure there were only what, like 25 teams? 23 teams. And in the Eastern Conference, the Celtics won 65 games.
Yeah.
So that was going to be, that just having one team like that in a conference that's got, 11 teams, 12 teams, that's going to take it. It's funny. You see that again now with these play-in games. You see teams that are, quote unquote, in the playoffs, if they're like a 10 seed, that have that level of record. Mm-hmm. But Jordan misses most of the season. He wants to come back. The Bulls do not want him to come back. They're trying to play for more draft picks. And he manages to come back on like a and if you've seen The Last Dance, this is spelled out really in a lot of detail. He wants to play, but they keep him on such a strict minutes restriction that there were games where there were like 3 seconds left in the game and they would take Jordan out, even though the outcome was still in question, only because they were being so strict with him with this minutes limit. But they make it into the playoffs, and the day before, it's a story that's gotten famous. Jordan's playing golf with Danny Ainge and some others. Ainge beats him, and he says to Ainge, "I got something for you and DJ," meaning Dennis Johnson, the next day. And he goes and he on this crazy tear in game 2 against the Celtics. He scores 63 points, and a little bit of a description here. The contest went to double overtime. In 53 minutes of playing time, Jordan took 41 shots and made 22 of them. The Celtics fouled him plenty. He made 19 of 21 free throws. His 63 points was the NBA's all-time single-game playing record. Larry Bird later says that's God disguised as Michael Jordan. And after that, the Celtics decide that the rest of the Bulls stink. So they're going to double team Michael Jordan for game 3. And I should say that even though the game goes into overtime, the Celtics win it. And then the Celtics from there decide that they're going to double Michael Jordan and let somebody else try and beat them, which nobody can. And so the Celtics pick up a win in game 3 in Chicago. And that's the end of the series. This is not exactly a stellar Celtics team. They do have an aging George Gervin, a Hall of Famer, on their roster. But other than that, you're talking about guys like Kyle Macy and Sidney Green and Orlando Woolridge and Jawan Oldham and Oakley. Charles Oakley is on that team. I think that's Oakley's rookie year because I think he got there the year after. Yeah, it's Oakley's rookie year. He got there the year after Jordan. So not a good Bulls team, but an amazing performance by Jordan.
And for the record, in game one, he also scored 49 points in just a regulation loss. So it's not like that 63 came out of nowhere. He scored 80% as many in regulation.
So that's the NBA for 86. I think we probably would be a good time to talk about the aftermath of the 86 NBA season. But do you have anything else from the NBA season in 86 you want to bring up?
The only thing I would say, because I always look up with these, like, what was this the first year for, or what was this the last year for? This was the first year that the backboard height was shortened. So obviously the top of the backboard was brought down to, I believe, what it is currently. So the backboard was taller, and they cut it down by 6 inches.
I did not know that.
I didn't know that either before like anytime you pull up an NBA season on Wiki, or like any sports specific season on Wikipedia, it'll say like rule changes, and then it'll give you, I'll see if I can find the specifics real quick. But it'll always say like slight things that changed, and I believe for the 1985-86 season that it said the backboard length was shortened, so that had to have been the top of the backboard.
It's just worth noting that, like we said, that the Lakers they rearm, they re-up, and then by the following season, they're ready to dominate again. They beat the Celtics in the 87 finals, make it back in 88, win it again. And so like we said, it's kind of a high point for the Celtics. No more championships, only one more finals appearance from there on out. But the Lakers stay in that dominant position for at least another 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So you're right. We should talk about the aftermath. And I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about one thing specifically when we talk about the 1986 NBA season or postseason.
So I think the thing that's maybe most, or not the most interesting thing, but the thing we should start with, despite winning the NBA championship, the Celtics have the number 2 draft pick in the 86 draft. We're into the lottery era by this point. I mentioned some of the guys that were gone. They had traded away Gerald Henderson in 84. They'd gotten the first round draft pick of the Seattle Supersonics for the 86 draft. Seattle stinks. So this ends up being the number 2 pick in the NBA draft. And I want to look real quick here and see who was picked first in 86. Brad Daugherty from UNC was the first overall pick and
that was an era where you couldn't pass up a legitimate big man. So, it obviously made sense that he would go number 1.
And Daugherty, had a good career, 5-time All-Star. Those Cavs teams with Price and Larry Nance, those were some good teams. And so the Celtics pick a guy from and who played in an area that I'm about 10 minutes from as I sit here, University of Maryland star forward Len Bias, who a lot of people viewed as a can't miss prospect. And unfortunately, things go tragically wrong.
I remember I must have been in either junior high or high school the first time I really knew about this story. And this was, I think, the second 30 for 30, which was done as a real good thing. And I
watched it the other night.
Here's the thing. And I'm not trying to be flippant or like a New York sports fan when I talk about this. I think so much of this has gotten absorbed into the narrative of Boston sports that we almost lose sight of just how big a tragedy this was, irrespective of what it would have meant for the Celtics going forward, or the fact that a Boston team didn't win a championship for 20 years. And again, I get that's the tendency. Like I said, I'm not being a homer here in a minute. Let's just forget about where he was drafted for a moment.
Well, let me just say one thing. Where it doesn't get absorbed into the Boston sports narrative
is in Washington, D.C.
In D.C., yeah.
So let's just step away from it for a minute. A guy who's one of the best players in the country, I'm assuming was an All-American in 1986, maybe in the Player of the Year in 1986, is drafted second overall, which means he's about to have a lifestyle change in terms of money. Family is about to have a lifestyle change in terms of money. Gets drafted, flies to the city that he's been drafted to, signs an endorsement deal or has discussions for an endorsement deal with Reebok, meets the team, has a photo op and all of that, flies home, goes back to his college dorm room. 12 hours later is dead from a cocaine overdose. 22 years old. And then, to sort of compound the tragedy in the era, and then also given that it was a young basketball star, on top of that, then his friends, who really their biggest crime was just being there with him, some of them end up doing heavy jail time. So again, I understand it. And it's natural to think, wow, the 86 Celtics were so good. And think about what would have happened if they added this guy, Len Bias. Let's not lose sight of just what happened.
And I think it's hard. I'm trying to think. Again, you feel strange making it about basketball. But I'm trying to think, and maybe basketball is really the only sport where it could happen, but of a guy who we never got to see in the pros, or almost never got to see, who came out with that much fanfare. Usually guys they're busts, maybe they're Rick Mirer and they come out and they play a few seasons and they're Ryan Leaf and they stink. But the fact that he didn't overdose in his first season, he didn't overdose a year or two in. And it's like this eerie thing when you watch it that he spent a day in Boston. It's like he was a Celtic. He was an NBA player for one day. Like you see these pictures of him with the jersey or, smiling after making the shoe deal. And it's just, it's eerie, first of all, because you're looking at a guy who's going to be dead in a day and he doesn't realize it. But beyond that, it's like the fact that he was there for a day, it would almost have been, it would have been less haunting if he had just died on draft night instead of going up there for a day, if that makes any sense.
Picture of him in the Celtics hat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
so, it obviously a bunch of stuff happened after that. The family was almost duty bound to sue the school. Just they needed to be able to sue somebody. And then tragically, Lenny Bias's other brother was shot and killed. Or Lenny Bias's brother was shot and killed a few years after that. It's hard to find an analog for it. You have guys who Hank Gathers dropped dead. And I think it's tough to also separate it from the culture at the time, which he was either a cautionary tale of reduced to a just say no message, or like I said, a bunch of his friends got thrown in prison. I'd like to think if it happened now, we'd have a little bit more compassion about just like, he wasn't killed committing an armed robbery. He wasn't killed, driving 130 miles an hour down the street high on drugs or drunk or whatever. He was recreationally using cocaine. In 1986 did not distinguish him from most people.
He was young and dumb and made a young mistake.
And had just come into, I know he didn't receive any of it yet, but it just been told he was going to be rich. So he's probably, I don't necessarily buy this was the first time he'd ever done cocaine. Not that it matters, but I feel like over time, Len Bias himself got lost in this story to whether you wanted it to be about drugs, whether you wanted it to be about, the corruption of NCAA sports, which somehow got woven into that, whether you wanted it to be about what would have happened to the Celtics in the late 80s. And I'm not saying people who wonder about that were diminishing Len Bias dying, because I don't think that's the case. But a 22-year-old who had all his dreams come true was dead a day later or 2 days later.
And it's a catalyst. I think we grew up, I don't know when my first memory of, of culture is, but it's probably only a year or two after that. And
for you, yeah.
People have said that his death was sort of, obviously the just say no and the drug stuff was out there already, but people have said that sort of the what we know is kind of the modern war on drugs and anti-drug messaging sort of started with that. So it's funny you realize something that maybe the world you grew up in on a day in and day out basis was heavily influenced by that event. Just real quick on the basketball side of it, it is interesting to think about the fact that, because if you think about it too, I mean, how many world champion teams have added a guy like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, they had the second pick on the draft after having one of the greatest seasons of all time.
Which is ironically, and this shows you what a genius Red Auerbach was. The only previous time that happened or something similar was in 1980 after Bird's rookie year, when he'd somehow managed to trade basically a bag of balls and engineer a trade that brought both McHale and Parrish in. So it is interesting to think. And again, you don't know so many things from an on the court point of view, but it is interesting to think that maybe the Celtics would have been better. Maybe Bird's career would have lasted a little longer. It's just, you don't know, but you do have to, I think, acknowledge the fact that to not get a guy who was really supposed to play a major role on the team for years to come, that probably did set their organization back.
Absolutely.
Should we talk a little bit real quick about the college hoops?
I was going to say the exact same thing just because we're on basketball. Of the 4 previous years, we'd have probably had a lot more to say.
Because those were all those years with Georgetown and UNC and Nova and all those Big East teams. And what was it? 83 was Valvano and NC State.
And then 84, Georgetown finally wins. 85 is the Villanova-Georgetown game.
And 82 is Jordan's championship.
Is Ewing's freshman year. Yeah. So Louisville beats Duke in the NCAA championship game. It's an interesting year because some low seeds make the tournament or make it far. Cleveland State is the first 14 seed to make the Sweet 16. LSU gets to the Final Four as an 11 seed. Navy makes it to the Elite Eight, led by the Admiral David Robinson. And as far as the NCAA tournament goes, this is the only year of a certain confluence of things. It's the first year of something and the last year of something.
Well, I know it's Krzyzewski's first title game. Is that the first of what you're talking about?
About rules.
I do know this because it's about something about what I want to talk about. It's the first year of the shot clock, 45 seconds.
Yep.
And it's the last.
In response, by the way, to Villanova and Georgetown the year before.
It's the last year where there's no 3-point line.
Correct.
And it is Krzyzewski's first year in the championship game, I believe.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it was.
So Duke plays Kansas in the Final Four, and Kansas is led by Danny Manning, who we were talking about Walton a minute ago. Manning is another one of these guys who ends up being a much better college player than he is a pro. And 86, that's got to be Larry Brown's Kansas team, right? I would think, because he was the coach a couple years later when Manning won the title. Let me pull up the 85-86 Kansas Jayhawks basketball team here, and I got the roster here.
Think about Danny Manning, that being kind of the start of the, it's 10 years later that his brother is at Tennessee and still continues to this day. It's like he was in the basketball championship in the mid 80s, or at Kansas, and then 10 years later his brother's at Tennessee, and then his youngest brother at Ole Miss. And
that is remarkably incorrect. They're not related.
Danny Manning is not Peyton Manning's brother.
No,
I don't know about that.
No, they have different parents, and one is black and the other is white. No, they're not. They're not related at all. But anyway, yeah, this is the 85-86 Kansas team. They make the Final Four. They're coached by Larry Brown, and they lose to Duke in 85-86 in the Final Four, and that's Krzyzewski's first Duke team, and they put a guy in the Final Four. They put a guy by the name of Mark Allery is who they have guard Manning, and Allery holds Manning to 2 of 9 shooting. Duke then goes on to play in the championship game against Louisville, and they lose to Louisville 69-72. And I just want to sort of, there's an interesting story about that championship game. The final score is 72-69. Like Andrew said, it was a first year of the 45-second shot clock. Louisville is up 70-69. They run the shot clock down, but couldn't get a good shot down as it winds down to 0. A player by the name of Jeff Hall launches an air ball that was short, so it goes right to Purvis Ellison for Louisville, who dunks it, grabs it, dunks it, and puts Louisville up by 3. And two things that Duke fans lament. Number one, there was no three-point line, so they couldn't go down and try and tie it up with a three-pointer. And number two, in later years, an air ball would not reset the shot clock. But in the first year of the shot clock, it's considered a shot just by, appearing to be a shot. But this is something that comes later, the change. And so for those two, now who knows, Duke would have still had to have scored points. They were still losing. But this is Krzyzewski's first year in the Final Four. He obviously has a lot more to come, but they lose this game. I just want to look at this Louisville team because I want to give them their due. Head coach is Denny Crum, who's a well-known, longtime college basketball coach. Not a lot of guys you maybe would have heard of on this Louisville team. Purvis Ellison, who played in the NBA for a number of years, forward, center, big man, is probably the one you've heard of most from Louisville. Duke's got guys like Danny Ferry, Jay Billis, who's somebody who's well known in the world of college basketball as an analyst, even to this day. Quinn Snyder, Tommy Amaker, who later goes on to be a longtime head coach. He's been the head coach at Harvard for the last 15 years. So Krzyzewski's first Final Four team, his first NCAA championship game team, very much a harbinger of things to come for 35 more years at Duke.
Yeah, which is still continuing. He's going into his last year this coming season, starting, right around now. Should we cover hockey real quick?
Yeah, let's do hockey real quick, and then maybe we do Nicklaus, because that's kind of a springtime type thing, the Masters.
Yeah, we can get into some other sporting stuff. So hockey, it's a weird year. It's the only time in a 5-year period where the Oilers don't win the Stanley Cup. They win in 83, they win in 84. They win in 84, 85, and then 87 and 88. This year, it's the Montreal Canadiens beating the Calgary Flames. I thought it might have been the last time two Canadian teams played for the in the Cup finals, but there was one a couple of years later.
Yeah, like 89, right?
89, yeah. I thought it might have been the last year. Wayne Gretzky wins his 7th straight MVP. So even though they didn't win that year, we're still very much in the middle of the Oilers dynasty. They finished with the best record in hockey. You're starting to see guys like Mario Lemieux coming up in the ranks. It's still very much the Gretzky, Messier Oilers are the class of the league. And then Patrick Roy has a really good playoffs, ends up the Conn Smythe Trophy winner as the Canadiens win their first cup. And it had been several years at that point. Because, well, if you think about it, before they had won in, I want to say 79, but the 6 years before that, you had the Islanders 4 times, and then you had the Oilers. So in a 9-year period, it was the Islanders 4 times, the Oilers 4 times, and then the Canadiens once. And this just happened to be that year.
Not a lot of room for teams to peek through.
No, and the Oilers, like I said, they won in 84, 85, 87, 88. And then I think a lot of people forget they won again in 90 without Gretzky.
After Gretzky was gone, yeah, that was Messier's team.
Yeah, so yeah, I didn't have a ton on hockey, and I don't mean to shortchange it, but obviously neither of us are huge hockey guys, and it's not a year where there's a ton of hockey stuff necessarily to focus on.
Now, did Gretzky have a dominant year that year? Was that one of his big dominant years, or?
I'll check. I mean, he won the MVP, but I'll check the standings, or I'll check his numbers. Hang on one second. Stats.
85, 86. Leads the league in assists, leads the league in points. Actually doesn't lead the league in goals. Only 52 goals. But yeah, and he's
it's the year he has the most points, though, 215 points.
Yeah, that is his career high for points, and that's what is the MVP trophy at this point? Is it the Hart Trophy? There's so many weird.
He had a high year for assists with 163. So if you think about that, the next closest year he had in assists was 135. So he had 2 assists a game, in addition to a goal a little more than once every other game.
Before we talk about Nicklaus, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to bring up quick from sports in 86?
Well, let's see.
We'll do Tyson later.
Let's see what I got here. Soccer, that was the 1986 World Cup. Was that
Maradona?
That was the very famous, and we talked about this in our in memoriam last year. 1986 World Cup. Argentina beats West Germany in the Stanley Cup, or in the World Cup final, but very famously, the quarterfinals against England was Argentina playing England in the quarterfinals in the very famous Hand of God game, where Maradona pretty clearly punches the ball and it should have been disallowed as a handball. And then after the game, he says basically it was part the hand of God and part the hand of Maradona. So one of the most famous plays in soccer history takes place there. Horse racing, not too much to cover really from a horse racing standpoint. 3 different horses win the 3 Triple Crown races, so don't think we need to spend too much time on that. The Indy 500, Bobby Rahal wins the Indy 500. It's the first time that someone has won the race in the under 3-hour mark. So he's the first one to break the 3-hour mark.
What are they at these days?
I don't know.
Let me pull that up. I'm just curious.
In tennis, you had Ivan Lendl won Wimbledon and the U.S. Open, and Martina Navratilova also won Wimbledon and the U.S. Open. On the women's side, Chris Evert won the French. I didn't realize there was only 3 Grand Slams back then. The Australian Open did not exist back then. So it was just the 3 major tournaments. I got another first for you for Wimbledon. It was the first time in Wimbledon history that a certain thing was used.
A certain thing was used.
Regarding the balls.
Regarding the balls, and incidentally, this year's Indy 500 winner was about 2 hours and 37 minutes.
Pretty significant shaving. I mean, if you think about it.
Yeah, another half hour probably. The first time certain things was used was like an automatic. I don't know.
First time yellow tennis balls were used at Wimbledon.
Now, had they been used other places?
That'd be my guess. The thing is, I guess if you think about it, if tennis balls are green, well, Wimbledon's a grass, it's a grass court. So it was not something I'd ever thought about, but I saw it on Wikipedia. So I'm assuming we'll talk about college football later.
We'll talk about that when we do football.
Okay. And then I will, since we're doing a bit of a junk drawer thing. It was a big year in professional wrestling. I won't go crazy about this, but you had 2 companies that kind of dominated the landscape. WWF was in the middle of their Hulkamania run. WrestleMania 2 was that year, but you also had Hulk Hogan and Paul Orndorff doing huge business as a feud going around the country with an angle that started right here in the Mid-Hudson Civic Center in Poughkeepsie, New York. They put
probably the biggest one of Hogan's feuds that never got any sort of pay-per-view blow off.
Yeah, it's definitely it's his biggest house show feud of all time. Culminated with 74,000 people outdoors in Toronto at the CNE Stadium. And then on the other side, you had the Jim Crockett Promotions out of the Carolinas. They were doing big business all over the country. And that was actually another interesting sort of story that broke over into mainstream news. Was one of their biggest up-and-coming stars was on pace to be Ric Flair's opponent at their biggest show of the year, a guy by the name of Magnum
TA, right?
Young, good-looking guy. Coming home from a town one night, he had dropped Dusty Rhodes off and was driving home in his Porsche way too fast and probably under the influence of something, got into a huge car wreck that made was the biggest story in Charlotte for weeks, and hospital switchboards were flooded, but ended the career of, he didn't die, he survived, but ended the career of a promising sort of up and coming wrestling star. So very interesting year in wrestling. There was a day where both the WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions ran shows in Cincinnati at the same time, and they each drew like 15,000 people. So there was like 35,000 people in one city went to see wrestling that day. But
can you imagine driving through Cincinnati that day and realizing that most of the people you're driving by are going to see wrestling?
Yeah, well, I think it was the WWF was at the Riverfront Coliseum, and Crockett was at the Cincinnati Gardens. So just an interesting story. So we can get back to more. But I mentioned wrestling in 1920 and 1941. I felt like I had to do it in 86, in a year I actually knew some things about.
Well, and wrestling is a renewed focus here on the Sports History Network, as Andrew was thrilled to hear. So, all right, you want to do golf?
Yeah, and specifically the Masters. This was the famous year of Jack Nicklaus winning the Masters at, I believe, 46 years old, and it was his 18th major. Am I correct on that?
It was his 18th major. He had not won a major since 80. In 80, he had won the U.S. Open and the PGA, and so you're right. He's 46 years of age, goes into this Masters. At the end of the third day, he's 2 under par, 4 strokes back of the lead, but 7 players are in front of him. And I just want to pull up. Let me see if I can pull up here his last, because he basically has a round that's just incredible. And I want to see.
Starts making his charge on the 15th, but the back 9, it looks like he shot a 30 on the back 9.
Let me see. Is this, I think this is the last day. Yeah, this is the last day. So his last, starting with the 9th hole, he goes birdie, 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 bogey, birdie, par, eagle, birdie, birdie, par. So he's on fire. He's going against his best competition is a guy by the name of Steve Ballesteros.
Sevi
Ballesteros. And on the 15th hole, Ballesteros hits it into the lake, ends up with a bogey, and then Nicklaus, who himself eagles on 15. So you figure he picks up, and they're not in the same pairing, but nonetheless, he picks up 3 strokes on 15 from Ballesteros. And that's basically going into the 15th hole. Ballesteros was -9. Nicklaus was -5. So they were 4 strokes apart. They're only 1 stroke apart after 15. And again, keeping in mind that this is not happening exactly the same time because they're, one's ahead of the other. And then at the end of 16, they're tied. They're both at -8.
On 16, by the way, Nicklaus hits the ball within 3 feet of the hole.
Yeah,
off the tee. So it's almost a hole in one.
Yeah, it's a par 3, and he birdies it, so that's a 2-stroke hole. Yeah. So he wins at 46. He is, at the time, he is the 3rd oldest guy to win a major. And really, he's the 2nd oldest because the highest at the time, the oldest at the time, is Julius Boros in the 1968 PGA. The 2nd highest is old Tom Morris in 1867 at the British Open. I don't know.
He was probably just Tom Morris.
Well, no, because there were 2 Tom Morrises. There was him and his son. There was old Tom Morris and young Tom Morris.
Young Tom Morris has been dead for 100 years.
So it's really, at the time, if you only count sort of rounds that were played, events that were held when there were no living slaves, then it's just Boros in 68. And then
I believe that, by the way, is like how when when the baseball season went up to 162 games and they started keeping two separate records, one for 154 game season and one for 162 game season. I believe that's what they did with golf, is rounds played when there were living slaves and rounds when there were no living slaves.
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, we wouldn't have the expertise for it, although I'm sure, knowing you and me, we could do an hour on it. It would be interesting to do an episode on, like, we should maybe do a series one day on, like, the really early days of every sport, like, as a series, like
very beginning of anything. Yeah. Like that first college football game that was like, you had to kick the ball and a goal, and if you got it in the goal, it's just soccer.
More players died than there were points, like, but anyway, so Nicklaus has this incredible game. It's his last major win. It's his last great performance on the big stage. And it is, he's second all time in the modern era as far as age for winning a major. He's later bypassed. He and Boros are both bypassed by Phil Mickelson just this past year, when Mickelson won the PGA at the age of 50. First guy over 50 to win a major was Mickelson this year. But this is considered sort of one of the great performances in golf history, is this Sunday at the Masters by Nicklaus. And in some ways, what's almost more impressive is not so much that he wins, but that he's able to get past so many guys in the one day.
Yeah. And that the one shot he hits to win it is one of the, when you see the Masters commercials in early April with the sort of genteel music and all of that, that's one of the ones you see him during the NCAA tournament. You see the ads for the Masters, and that's one of the famous shots, is him hitting the shot to win, hitting his last putt on 18 to win the Masters in 86.
Yeah, sticking his fist in the air as the putt is rolling in.
Yep.
All right, so we've done the NBA and we've done college basketball and we've done some of this other stuff. As predicted, we think this is going to be a 2-part episode. So here's what I'm going to suggest. Why don't we do, I think, other than baseball and football, I think the only other thing we really have left is to talk about Tyson. And so do you want to maybe wrap it up with boxing and specifically with Mike Tyson?
Sure. Before we get to Tyson specifically, one other boxing story from the year. There was a big fight, June 13 of 86 at the Garden, Hector Camacho versus Edwin Rosario. It was an HBO fight. It was a fairly big, fight for a championship. But the note I saw on this, days later, El Vocero newspaper reported of a murder related to the fight. Apparently, a man had made a bet with another man, and after Rosario lost, the murder victim told his killer that he really didn't have any money, causing the killer to get enraged and shoot him. But listen, here, the Wikipedia article, I'm going to read the last 2 sentences of the Wikipedia. It's in a section called Aftermath. Told his killer that he really didn't have any money, causing the killer to get enraged and shoot him. Period. New paragraph. A rematch had been planned in 1997, but it never occurred. Now, that's obviously referring to a rematch of the fight. The way it's laid out sounds like they're saying a rematch of the shooting was planned. Yeah, of course it didn't occur. The guy had been dead for 10 years. But anyway, yeah. So,
and it's fitting. It's fitting when we talk about Tyson, because we're going from the oldest Masters champion to the youngest heavyweight boxing champion of all time.
Yes. So the thing that stands out to me about a lot of this, Mike Tyson in 1986 won the heavyweight championship on November 22nd against Trevor Berbick. I remember that, A, because it's one of my best friends was born on that day, and B, Trevor Berbick is always it's so interesting to me because Trevor Berbick fought Muhammad Ali. So
only 5 years earlier.
So there's a guy who fought Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali.
And he beat Ali, didn't he? Wasn't that Ali's last fight?
Ali's last fight, yeah. The other thing that's interesting to me is like, okay, he was young, so you really should know this, but it doesn't really occur to you. Mike Tyson fought 13 times in 1986. Mike Tyson began 1986, and I'm pulling it up, fighting, I actually looked because I knew he had fought at the Mid-Hudson Civic Center in Poughkeepsie. That was in July of 85. But as early as his first fight in 86 was July 11th of 1986. And he fought in places like, he fought in Albany, he fought in Troy, New York, he fought in Glens Falls. He was at this point living in Catskill and is, where he went as a kid with Customato. But, it was not like it was a precipitous rise. He began the beginning of the year fighting in places in front of 500 people. And by the end of the year, he's fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world. And by the first couple of months of 87, he has unified the titles.
So we should take a step back here. Tyson, born in Brooklyn, sort of grows up there, gets himself in, legal trouble, ends up being, I guess, essentially adopted almost. I don't know if it's legal adoption or just sort of what it is, but he eventually gets taken in by this boxing trainer, Customato, who basically becomes the only father figure that Tyson ever has, brings him up to his place in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains, and that's where he trains to be this heavyweight fighter. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is as 86 dawns, D'Amato has passed away, and so Tyson's kind of entering a new phase of his life where he's got to figure some things out without his trainer and father figure in Customato.
Yeah, and he's still very young, is fighting, pretty consistently. Look, January 11th, January 24th, February 16th, March 10th, and he's, first round knockout, fifth round knockout, sixth round knockout, third, then a couple of decisions, and then starting in June, actually on the undercard of that first fight I just mentioned, TKO in the first round, KO in the first round, KO in the second round, another first round KO, and then he starts jumping up. In August of 86, he fights. That fight was, he fought Marvis Frazier, Joe Frazier's son, and
he beats him in like 30 seconds, right?
Then he starts to make the jump where he's fighting in Atlantic City. Then he's fighting in Vegas. In September of 86, he fights in Vegas against a guy named Alfonso Ratliff, knocks him out in the second round. 12 fights between January 1st and September 6th of 86. And that sets him up for November 22nd against Trevor Berbick. He's 27-0 going into that fight. Berbick's got the WBC heavyweight title, so he's got one heavyweight championship. There's still a few others out there. It's not a unified title. And Tyson knocks him out in the second round, take TKO in the second round to become the WBC heavyweight champion. Within a couple of fights in early 87, he has unified all three heavyweight champions and holds for 4 years, becomes a boxing and cultural phenomenon, which really he still is. I mean, there's been ups and downs to that. He's been over vilified. He's been under vilified. He's been given too much credit from an intelligence standpoint. He's been given not enough credit from an intelligence standpoint. But in 1986, when he's winning this heavyweight title, he is unlike anything anybody's seen in a very long time in the boxing circles.
And he's a guy who knows and has a lot of love and respect for boxing history. Dave Anderson, writing in the New York Times, says Tyson is much more than merely the youngest boxer to hold a share of the heavyweight title. He's the glow of a new dawn, the heavyweight that the boxing public has been waiting for since Muhammad Ali stumbled into the sunset, which was only a few years previously. And I also would note that when he knocks out Berbick, he goes over into his corner and he says, "Do you think Cuss would have liked that?" So he's still very much trying to impress D'Amato even after the man has been dead. And this is, it doesn't get much better for Tyson than 86 and early 87.
Yeah, he just continues the run of knocking guys out in the first round. And you can go back to one of our earliest episodes on the history of the heavyweight boxing title. I think I think he's the first part of the second episode, or the second part, or the end.
Yeah,
end of the first episode, or the first part of the second episode.
It's the beginning of the second episode. Highly recommend checking it out.
He's this force of nature. He's knocking guys out in the first and second rounds. I think his biggest buildup was to Michael Spinks, and he just demolishes Spinks in like the second round. There's a post-fight press conference once where they ask him what his best punch is, and he says my left, and they're like going insane. They're like, you're knocking all these guys out with like your right like hook. Like, how can you say your left's your best punch? He's like, I haven't gotten to that yet. Like, I haven't had to get to there yet. And again, you can talk about what happened later. In 91, this run of it kind of comes to an end in 91 with Buster Douglas, and there's ebbs and flows throughout the rest of his career and life, which, not to get off topic for a second, but if you had told me that Mike Tyson would still be alive in 2021, I'd be pretty amazed by that, to be honest.
Didn't he just fight an exhibition on like Christmas or something?
He might have. I mean, there's this guy coming from Brownsville, Brooklyn, and then being hid in Catskill, New York, really not that far from here, but not far from where I live. But he gets his first piece of the heavyweight title November 22nd, 1986, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and is about to shoot into the stratosphere culturally. By the late 80s, he's one of the biggest athletes in the world. If you think about, at least in this country, Joe Montana, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, eventually Michael Jordan, but Mike Tyson is in the top 5.
Oh, without question. When we did the boxing episode, we talked about how it was like, the closest comparison is like Hulk Hogan. It's just this guy who's everywhere, ads, video games, just everything. Tyson represents the 80s and that period in the 80s better than maybe any other athlete.
Yeah, the late 80s. Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about Tyson. We've talked about Nicklaus. We've talked about Magic and Bird and a little bit of Coach K at the beginning and some other various things. Andrew gave us a little bit of a wrestling education, which is always appreciated. So why don't we call it a show for part 1 of our 1986 journey? And we got a lot to talk about in the second episode. We're only at baseball and football left to cover, but I mean, the 1986 baseball playoffs can be its own episode, and then can almost be its own episode. And then obviously the 86 Giants, and that season has got a lot of special place in our hearts too. So why don't we call this part 1 and we'll reconvene and do part 2 covering baseball and football in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about the 1986 Giants, the 1986 Mets, some interesting college football angles to get into, tons and tons to get into.
Absolutely. And an interesting theme that runs through a lot of this is people who were at the top of their game in one respect or another, and then later suffered some sort of a downfall. And we'll get into a lot more of that when we talk about the 86 baseball and football seasons. But that's your first look into 1986. We'll catch you next time for the conclusion. But until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.